What is going on? Welcome back to the stream here with Phoenix. It is Sunday, April 19th. Hard to believe it's been like a flash of a few weeks, yet it feels eerily like Groundhog Day at times. I hope you guys are finding your way into health and wellness, taking care of yourselves during this 19 fun. So if you like this content, consider hitting the like button, consider subscribing to this channel, and without further ado, let's get into things. So obviously we've seen in the crypto markets things remaining somewhat flat as we kind of predicted and talked about on this channel, although we do have the Bitcoin halving that is approaching very soon, and it will be interesting to see the response just from a stock to flow perspective. Obviously, with the Bitcoin halving taking place, there'll be much less supply available to any buyers who'd be interested in acquiring for the Bitcoin. Now, assuming the demand for Bitcoin stays the same, because there's less supply on the market of Bitcoin, we could expect the price to actually rise. Now, we haven't really seen Bitcoin in a somewhat deflationary environment slash inflationary environment at the same time. We see asset prices that are obviously falling. Even locally here in the Arizona Phoenix market, we're seeing prices for real estate on the higher ends collapsing. There's absolutely no demand for them here locally. So will that continue to play out, and will we actually see that in lower priced assets? I mean, that's still up in the air. Now, we are seeing inflation for goods that may have been overlooked in the past, and that's what this video is going to kind of be about. I mean, we're seeing raging demand for gold and silver assets. We've seen the U.S. Mint actually close. For those that don't know that, the U.S. Mint did cease operations production of coins such as gold, platinum, and silver. So while the effects are not seen now in the market for those, you are seeing some slightly higher premiums to acquire those things. If those facilities remain shut for a prolonged period of time, again, for those types of assets similar to Bitcoin, you're going to start to see higher premiums that, in my mind, or I'm predicting, decouple from the paper markets that you're seeing for those asset prices. So those are some things to keep in mind, guys. And one of the interesting things about this whole, I wouldn't even call it the 19 pandemic, I would call it an experiment, because, and that's what the title of this video is about. It's about the recognition that an event like 19 was just the linchpin of a very weakened system from a financial perspective, from a logistics perspective, and even just the way that most people live, especially in the United States. A lot of this stuff was, the weakness was already there, and we had something like Corona that just actually exposed this weakness much sooner than probably what would have happened. And so we'll talk more about that today. So with that said, I mean, again, for those that haven't done so, well, I can't give you advice, obviously. This is not an investment advice channel, but I can tell you what I'm doing. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at those types of assets. I'm looking at, the likes of a gold, the likes of Bitcoin, because they aren't tied to necessarily debts. They're not debt-denominated instruments for the most part. Obviously, they do have liquidation pressures for firms that may be under some kind of a margin call, but it's unlikely that those physical assets, people who own the physical assets, would do that. And if they did, it would be on a localized basis. So you're seeing a transition from these digital markets, in my opinion, to actual local peer-to-peer markets, and assets that provide truth and transparency, or people feel they can trust, are going to be much more highly valued over assets that are rigged with corruption and cronyism. And so the contrast there would be something like an asset class of gold or Bitcoin over something like a paper dollar, which is given to select individuals or institutions And for the most part, other citizens get it, but it's distributed on a very rigged process, I would say, and even access to those loans. So uh, that's just, again, something to keep in mind, guys. And I think there's changing attitudes in the United States of what has been historically characterized as free market capitalism in the USA. And what do I mean by that? Well, we've always, heard this um, story, or we've always been told this line that, United States, we have free market capitalism. It's the best path to prosperity. You got guys like Larry Kudlow on CNBC, who's now within Trump's group. And I'm not, listen, I'm not either left or right. You guys know that I'm a atheist when it comes to the political systems, but I find it interesting that on the one hand, these folks are talking about free market capitalism, yet you're seeing um, movements and strategies that more resemble socialism to corporations and cronyism and neo-feudalism, in fact, for a lot of the common people um, who often are now having difficulties even getting their $1,200 stimulus checks, let alone these next rounds of stimulus. And I find it interesting that $1,200 was the amount given because of the fact that in most cities, if you live in any major city, say Phoenix, LA, New York, San Francisco, Dallas, I mean, these are huge, dense populations. And I can tell you the average rent in most of these places are just living in a lot of them or visiting them are somewhere between $1,500 to $2,500, and that's nothing special to write home to mom about. Those are just your average places. So to think that someone like Mnuchin feels that $1,200 would sustain somebody for 10 weeks is laughable. It's insane, but it shows you the dislocation in the recognition of facts on the ground from those who are making the rules or making the decisions and those who are living with it, right? There's a huge distortion in that reality. And so that's really becoming more apparent, guys. And something else to keep in mind is the fact that there's a lot of talk about, I guess, going back to this new normal and restarting the economy, when in fact the economy we have is non-functional. so here we have people that are talking about restarting a failed system. And I don't think a lot of people are talking about that. In fact, I haven't even seen guys like Pomp talk a lot about that. A lot of people are saying, we need to restart the economy. We need to get people back to work. And while that's recognized in some regards, there also needs to be a recognition that we never really did have a real economy. All that was based on fake money, fake credit and actual funds are different in a sense that you could have someone who is a speculator, and in this case, we're all speculators. That's the great thing that I learned in this whole situation, the past 10 years studying these things, is that we're all speculators in some way. The question is, do you allow others to speculate on your behalf, or do you choose to take control of your destiny, your financial destiny? And from the perspective of housing, for example, that's an example where a lot of people were forced to speculate even beyond what they would normally probably want to do, just in a sense of the ease and access of credit. Now, the ability to access credit and the ability to pay off that credit are two different things. So just because you sign up for a house, for example, and everybody else is doing it for $500,000 on a 30-year mortgage, doesn't necessarily mean that over that 30-year period of time, you're going to have the ability to service that debt. And so a lot of people, I think, forget that, that's not necessarily guaranteed. And the ability to take on that credit is very different than the ability to satisfy and support that debt instrument. And that's what it is. And so we might actually see a restoration of more historical or traditional um, asset prices relative to incomes, which we haven't seen and we currently don't see right now, which is a big reason why we're in the situation we're in. And that's just one example, looking at personal incomes, debts, and assets like houses. We could take that same model and look at hospitals, right? Hospitals right now, a lot of people would think that hospitals are doing so well during this economic or this pandemic or whatever you want to call it. The reality is a lot of people, because of the coronavirus, are actually staying home. And so they're deferring their surgeries and even their visits to doctors. And what's very interesting is, like a lot of businesses in the United States, like a lot of individuals in the United States, these hospitals have been so heavily financialized, so riddled with debt, and have so much little margin, okay, on their balance sheets and their ability to have cash reserves on hand, that many of them will actually be bankrupt because of the fact that they can't service their debt and they have so much little margin in how they operate as a business. And so I think we need to step away from thinking about going back to where we were as a society, even 3 months ago, and recognize that we need a re-architecture, a rebuilding of the system, because where we were 3 months ago wasn't even sustainable. You can't have a hospital. You can't run a system that is responsible for protecting and saving people from illnesses and all these things. That's heavily in debt and is actually purely, Wall Street banker investment driven profit motives versus the utility that they're supposed to provide for their communities. And that sounds maybe very socialistic, and you're probably surprised I'm saying that. But if you look at a lot of different things, including housing, where debt to income levels are so high, you have to wonder if those things are actually sustainable, or is it just based on the fact that someone gave somebody a loan with the promise that you would repay them, when in fact the actual levels of that are not even sustainable. It's not something that contractually you could actually satisfy. Okay, so all these things are set up in a sense to fail. So that needs to be recognized. And how do we get there? How do we get there and recognize that as a society? I'm not sure you can, because perhaps a lot of people are afraid to, and it's uncomfortable for them to recognize that vulnerability, right? Because it does hurt many people who have invested in that type of a system with these belief systems. And so that's, again, another interesting dynamic to this crisis, if you want to call it, is it's exposing a lot of these weaknesses, this linchpin, if you will, not just from a healthcare perspective, but from the fragility of the financial system itself. And so we see remnants of the themes we saw in 2008, repeating of the bailouts for the selected few, companies and corporations, etc., with little transparency on money flow or where these loans are going. And we see a high contrast of that with everyday small businesses, which are unable to gain access to critical loans. And as I just talked about with these hospital systems and even individuals, these small businesses have very little cash reserves to remain afloat without these credit loans, right? So how do we get to a society where we have such little margin in how a business is operated? I mean, how did it become so riddled with this debt and this dependency? And it really just stinks of system weakness. Okay, so you can put little linchpins on it and say, well, for now we'll give these business owners these loans, but again, on a long-term basis, is this even sustainable? My response is no. You have to destroy and rebuild the whole thing, unfortunately. And so now you're seeing frustration, I think, with a lot of people recognizing that they were basically conned and told a story, because that's what all this is. That's what life is about. When you wake up in the morning, you tell yourself a story of whether you recognize it or not. And the belief in the system, the belief that a lot of these frameworks for things like mortgages, things like loans, things like these educational systems and uh, government systems, right, are in our best interest. And we're seeing things that directly illustrate today that that narrative is being challenged just based on observation, purely observation. Leave the politics out of it. Uh, Obviously, Phoenix is not here to, instill any, um, instill in you any direction one way or another. You gotta do your own research, but just look around you. Have things gotten better or have things gotten worse? Over the past decade, over the past 2 decades, I'd say things have gotten a lot worse. And now we're seeing that frustration and recognition, probably a frustration, because now we're hearing of talk of bread and circus for $2,000 a month given each adult, $500 per child. And I think this is actually the start of UBI, or Universal Basic Income. And so there's a lot of unintended consequences with something like that. First of all, it gives much more dependence on the state or federal government uh, from people. And that means there's less drivers for innovation and problem solving and actually adding value to society as an individual and as a community. And without those incentive structures in place, it could actually lead to significant declines in, I think, standard of living overall. So on the one hand, you get short-term maybe benefits, short-term feelings of stability, perhaps by many people. But on the back end of it, there is a potential for that to be, I would say, demotivating, right, from how humans work, how humans are incentivized to do things. One of those is money and the value system we have, right, with how we create value and how we reward value. And that's already been eroded over time because we've seen occupations like nursing and even doctors and engineers and all these, I would argue, critical roles in society take a back seat to the Wall Street and financial elite, right, who make multiple times more than these critical roles in society. And so until we see that value system change and shift, I think we're going to see these issues continue because we have the same people in power that are only enriching themselves or the groups that they're affiliated with. And so another question, though, is how can government, or do we think government could remove those types of payouts to people once they're instated? And so I don't think that is the case, which is why I think this is the start of a UBI. And this may also shift the environment from a deflationary environment, which is where we're at now, and we've talked about that many times in this channel. In fact, last week or 2 weeks ago, we did a video explaining that, at least in the short term, most assets are deflationary in nature because of the fact that credit is actually eroding. It's getting eliminated. There's no credit creation. And so a lot of that is based on a lot of what you saw over the past few years was based on credit creation, credit expansion. And so now that credit is being destroyed, it doesn't matter really how much they print. There's a slowdown in the velocity of money for the everyday person. What's going on, Neil Kearney? He says, hi, where have you been? I've been actually just kind of like you guys in quarantine. I've been running, getting vitamin D, trying to stay exercise, growing a garden. Actually, today I'm trying to get some of those box planters to do some more gardening. It's pretty hard here, though, from a sense that I do live in Arizona, so the heat here is obviously pretty noticeable. I mean, right now it's beautiful. It's like 80 degrees outside, but come in May, June, we're roughing it, and it's 100 degrees, 110 degrees outside. So it's going to take some different types of strategies to actually even try to grow stuff here. So I've actually purchased some uh, grow lights, some very high efficient LED grow lights that are like 100 watts or 125 watts. And I'm able to grow, I'm experimenting with growing some produce that way. And then in the meantime, having, lentils or beans and rice, quinoa, things that I've always eaten anyway, just because of my lifestyle and my diet. But trying to supplement the fresh stuff that I would need to just continue to keep that the same. So I actually, if this wasn't my own place, I think what I would want to do, which sounds probably kind of crazy to some of you guys, is actually just have have grow walls on portions or rooms inside my place, because I have these lights and I have these shelving units, and actually that seems to work out pretty well. But obviously, since it's not my own place, I am cognizant of that, and I don't want to make it too crazy around here. So, but yeah, I mean, that credit destruction is really something to watch, guys, and I think that'll shift the environment from deflationary to inflationary. And so now what we're also seeing is, and kind of what goes to this point is, we're seeing institutions like JP Morgan and other banks changing what I call the goalpost. If you're in a soccer game or you've played basketball or football, you hear this term where, all this time there was a narrative of telling people, have a minimum of maybe 10% down and that would be adequate, 15%. Now they're saying for you to get a mortgage, you're going to have a minimum of 20% down on a house. Okay. Just to give you some perspective here in Arizona, I would say the average place is probably $400,000. So if you're looking at, maybe even $300,000 on the lower end if you want to live in some of those areas, but I mean, $400,000, 20% down, that would be $80,000. And you would have to have a minimum of a 700 credit score just to get access to a loan. What do you guys think that's going to do to the demand for real estate? It's going to erode it, okay, rapidly, very similar to what we saw in 2008, 2009, because we saw the same rules. In fact, you can Google it, go back in time, and look at what happened when they started instituting those rules. It put a huge downward pressure on the housing markets. And I'm not arguing that's a bad thing per se. I think that it might, in a sense, help. You have to look at it from both perspectives, though, because I think where the banks are is they don't want to get in a situation where they're loaning the people who are putting 3% down, and then those people are walking away once everything erodes and goes down hard. And so I think they're putting this 20% in there to help cushion their own blows because they know that the market is going to go down. But what's interesting is contrasting that with the likes of corporate bailouts or corporate loans to firms like Boeing. Now, you may say, Boeing is an essential company or firm, and I agree, but I see that, I understand the IP that a firm like Boeing would have, especially from the defense perspective and national security. One has to wonder then, well, how do you architect that in such a way where it's not structured in that way? And I'm not sure how you do that, but companies like Boeing actually have junk bond level credit ratings, and yet they're still approved to borrow billions of dollars. So again, there is this contrast in rules and guidelines for mortgages for everyday people and small businesses, yet the likes of a company like Boeing gets essentially free money because the interest rates these firms are paying is basically zero. So explain that one. That's just an example there, guys. And you're seeing others like the Harvards of the world also get access to this money. And so it brings up this moral hazard argument about who gets loans, who gets access to this credit, what do they do with it, and how is it benefiting society? What value is it actually creating to society? Because a lot of these firms are not benefiting society; they're not building anything, but yet somehow they're still given this money. So there is a lot of moral hazard that seems to be brewing, and those are seeds for actual like potential revolution or widespread anger, um, which is that it is what it is, but that's where we're at, and until people I guess fully understand that they've been stolen from in that way, it'll probably continue to go on. But one other interesting thing of this is you're even seeing this in the rental market. So we talked about how, uh, from a mortgage perspective or a home buying perspective, the 20% down is now the rule with the 700 score, which removes a lot of people. It probably doesn't, obviously doesn't remove everybody from the market. There are a lot of people who are conservative who have cash, but a lot of people just are not in that position. But what else is interesting here is that even for the, I would call them these mom and pop investors who have these houses who are renting to people, their structure of paying off that debt is maxed to leave no excess for failure of any kind by design. And what I mean by that is, you take on debt of some kind, get a mortgage, that amount you're getting every month, say to pay off that mortgage amount, if someone misses a loan, if someone misses a payment, a few months even, they're out. The same on the individual. That renter who's renting that place for $1,500 a month, they may only have like a very fixed amount to pay that rent to their landlord and pay enough to get food and gas, and that's it. So any failure in that system, in that delicate system, along the chain, any failure of any kind just destroys the whole thing. And so, I don't think, guys, that, and it could just be me, but I don't think to the degree of where we are now, it was always historically like that. And so that's what I mean by, I find it pretty funny that there's this narrative of going back to where we were 3 months ago, because even that wasn't sustainable. How can you have an environment where that is normal? And at some point, it costs the economy. It costs the economy in some way. It may not cost the economy from those landlord investors because they're getting their rents, but the lack of then excess funds to do other discretionary activities is reduced, right? So instead of those people paying for going out to a restaurant, they may stop doing that. But here's another thing is people in China know that their government owns everything. And in the US, we somehow think we are different. But with this type of environment and what we've seen in terms of policies for lockdowns, you almost have to wonder if we are, in fact, different. Because these shutdowns were mandated at state levels. We're seeing federal rules that determine when things reopen and what is required of you to even move or travel in some way. And what's interesting is the recent activities to maybe even take control of certain systems or assets is not necessarily very American. The tracking and surveillance speaks very highly to a different kind of society. And so I don't necessarily know if we are as free as we think we are. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But, with this type of situation, and just to maybe close this talk on a positive, there are opportunities to have improved systems and maybe reimagine systems. So some of those things are catalysts for the technologies that we've followed, right? I mean, you look at systems like blockchain, you look at virtual reality systems, and the fact that now, because people don't feel comfortable exactly going into a bar and being elbow to elbow with somebody else because of this 19 fun that we're all in, you could see a huge catalyst for whoever is able to put together the VR space in a cost-effective way, in a way that's accessible to everybody, and include some of the components we've not seen from that industry, at least to date. And so what I mean by that is the tactile and graphic support and the bandwidth that's required. Um, can we get there from a technology standpoint where your experience with another person in a virtual bar is just as good as a regular bar? Your dance experience at a club is just as good, if not better, than the experience you have today. And so these are real opportunities, I think, for a firm or a company who is able to hone in on that and master it to really thrive, because people at some point are going to seek those alternatives. It doesn't matter whether the economy is reopened or not. In my opinion, I don't really see this going back to the new normal until we are able to prove out the treatments, if you will. And there's a lot of people that fundamentally don't want to have certain treatments from certain individuals, and I think that's understandable given some of the histories with certain groups of people and what they've done to other groups of people. And so there's a lot of suspicion on things. And so that'll be a huge catalyst for alternative, not only alternative health systems, but just alternative ways of life. And one of those catalysts then would be the VR space, because of that that motivation to not be in spaces crowded with other people, regardless of whether or not there's a restoration of some things. There's a return to normalcy. I don't think you'll see a lot of those industries recover for a very long time. And so in the meantime, there's this huge gap of what do you do now? And I think VR fills that gap. But even like practical systems like AC systems and healthcare systems and food creation systems. I mean, for a long time, you look at like AC systems out here in Arizona, and the fact that these systems spew, they bring in air, right, from the environment, they cool it, and they force out the hot air in the environment, and that is not necessarily immune to spreading whatever this virus is. And we could argue about the extent of the virus, the mortality rate of the virus, but just staying inside the house doesn't necessarily make someone immune to not getting exposed to the virus, simply because in an environment like this, you have AC systems and they may or may not have the appropriate filtration. They may or may not have the appropriate filtration with them. And so what do you do? What do you do in an environment like that? How do you reimagine that system to make it more safe, make it secure, and make it appropriate for the new world that we live in? I don't know how you do that, but that's something I've been looking at. I actually purchased, as part of my improvised mask systems, materials that have higher filtration rates, so that when I'm making a mask, I can make it with that layer that is comparable to a 99 mask, even beyond a 95. But they also have that for AC systems, but how many people are actually looking at that now? How many people have you actually seen make recommendations on health, for example, health vitamins and supplements that actually do improve chances to beat 19? Not many. It's just a lot of fear and just like a lot of focus on the treatments and a lot of focus on like traditional ways like shots versus take these vitamins every day, or we know that this is proven to prevent certain aspects of the virus from flaring up and compromising immune systems. We haven't seen it yet. So I wonder kind of why, but I'll kind of leave that up to you guys to figure out. And then we have again this food systems, right? So food creation systems. You think about the fact that most food is brought in and it's a 3-day look ahead or a 2-day look ahead or even a 1-day look ahead in a lot of grocery stores. And so how do we get from that model to a model where it's just grown locally, and each person maybe has their own ways to grow and systems that actually enable us to do that? And so that's kind of what I'm interested in more, food creation systems, localized systems versus going back to what we had, because what we had wasn't even sustainable. And so that may even involve food cooked and consumed, and what you cook and consume as maybe being some factor in your body's ability to fight infections. We haven't really looked at that either. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about vitamins and some minerals, but how about the actual foods themselves, and the fact that, one of the interesting things for me as a black man is the fact that now we're hearing that such high rates of mortality, or the percentage of people who are dying from the virus versus the population by race. And I'm not making a racial statement here. I love everybody, you all know that. But I'm just saying what's interesting is that there's a higher rate of death, it seems, in certain races over others. And so it begs the question about whether or not the virus has components that make certain backgrounds more susceptible to death, just because they are overcome with the elements of the virus, or is it that certain choices or decisions, certain foods that are consumed by certain people, or certain environmental factors that they have, make them more susceptible to actually succumb to the virus? That needs to be something that we better understand as a society, as a species. And so it'll be very interesting, I think, from that perspective, to see the change in perhaps mortality between certain folks of a certain background living in the United States versus others living in other regions of the world, right? And do those mortality rates stay the same? Are they worse? Or, and what was the healthcare system in a lot of those places? Did they have vaccines? Did they take on other types of treatments? All that plays maybe into this thing that we're experiencing right now. And so those are the kinds of things we need to think about. And this may also shift, obviously, water demand, because now that we'll see people interested more in growing their own food on a local basis, the need for basic essentials like water and food will become higher on the economic value scale, whereas for a long time they were overlooked, right? And this throws out a lot of older models. And even for myself, I mean, as somebody who's always been a fan of, not always been a fan, but I mean, hey, urban living or living in a city is it has its advantages. There's a lot of things to do in a city, and going out and having a great time. But things like this event question that whole narrative. I mean, you've seen a lot of cities, and I'll just give you an example here. You've seen a lot of cities invest tremendous amounts of money in basically the urban experience, I would call it, right? The ability to live in a more dense environment, walk to the store, walk to the shop, take public transportation, take an Uber somewhere, have stuff sent from Amazon or from somewhere, even out of the country, sent to you, and these elements of things, that venues and concerts and experiences that we all, I think, for the most part, value as humans. Yet these types of events, this type of event specifically, puts all that, I guess, puts all that at a question, because now the value system is more perhaps separatist, and not in a bad way, but more isolationist, more resilient, more independent, with food production, with modes of transportation, with the freedom to have space, right? And so it runs in complete contrast to this narrative that had been occurring, I'd say, for the past 10 or 15 years, especially in the United States. You look at a lot of these cities, a lot of these communities, especially in urban cities, this revival of dense living, apartments and studios and condos. And I kind of wonder, like, on a long-term basis, if that'll still be valued, just because A lot of those systems do not provide you the same means to have independence, right? They are highly dependent. They're highly dependent from a food production standpoint because you have to rely on centralized systems for your food. They're highly dependent in the sense that you cannot water harvest. They probably assume some dependency on an Uber or public transportation. You probably can bike around, but you're also exposing yourself to a higher density population, right? So you're interacting with many more people in that area versus an area that is less populated. Um, Perhaps the skill sets are also different in those areas. So you're looking at skill set distribution and practical skills versus um, maybe other types of skills that, while they are amazing and lovely to have, and there are influencers and people who do a lot of things, like that is what they do. I'm not one of them, obviously. I just do these videos, guys, to have interesting conversations with you guys, right? As someone in the crypto community, as someone who loves economics, I don't do these videos to make money. I do these videos because I like to have relationships and conversations with people all around the world who are like-minded or who like to think about things like this. But I think that it's going to force many of those people to maybe reevaluate even what they're doing, because it's like maybe perhaps a lot of that value system was based on excess credit, excess time, even, in a sense that we lived on very efficient systems, which were dependent on global distribution systems. And now we're going to go to inefficient local systems, which means that maybe to produce the same amount of food, maybe it is very inefficient in a sense that, like, for example, here in Arizona, it's very hot, and maybe the water supply isn't as reliable. Maybe the yield isn't as good, okay, in some respects. Maybe it requires you to grow your own food inside if you're in a very cold environment or very warm environment. But even though it is inefficient, you contrast that to the security it gives you. So there's like a balance between efficiency and security of resources. And so the question is, what do you value more? And maybe perhaps what does this look like in a year or two from now? And so with that, maybe you'll see a change in the price of an asset in that type of environment, in an environment like an urban environment, a dense environment with condos where you don't have the ability to gain that independence versus another location, another environment, somewhere else, maybe in the United States or in a different country, where you do have that freedom to gain that independence, okay? The basic facets of life. And we've never seen that as a species. We've never seen that as a human, as humans really on this earth. We've never had I would say we've never had to approach or really consider that because we really haven't had to. But this type of environment forces you to confront. That's the word I was looking for. It forces you to confront those realities, those choices, that's type of speculation that we've often overlooked. And with that, you're seeing perhaps then stresses on pension systems, because keep in mind that a lot of cities, including here and other systems all around the United States, have these pension systems with governmental workers who they've maybe worked for 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, 40 years of their career at a lot of these institutions. And they've been promised, somewhere between, I would say, 50% and 70, 80% of their incomes as a minimum. And now those pension systems are no different than a lot of our 401ks, in a sense that they're invested in a lot of different assets. Now, those assets are going to collapse, right? A lot of them may even go to zero because they were sold toxic junk. And when that happens, first of all, keep in mind that a lot of those pension workers, many of them, maybe even, or city workers, maybe, or state workers, may be forced to retire early because they are laid off because of this whole situation. Now, you have less people left in that workforce that are paying into these pension systems. which means it puts even more of a tax on them. And at the same time, you have more of those retirees drawing from the reserves that are remaining, which increases the speed of insolvency, okay? The speed of insolvency with those systems. And I think what you're going to see, and what I predict you're going to see if this continues on, you're actually going to see those systems transition from where they're at now, which is having reserves and having people, able to draw on them, their promised amounts. You're going to see those systems transition to a pay-as-you-go, where that societal contract they sign with the states and cities are dynamic, and the safety net they thought they had may not necessarily be there, because there'll be so much stress to just deal with the resources they have, and the amount they have versus what they promised they were going to have is going to be very, very different. And a lot of the pension managers who promise 7% year over year, which, by the way, a lot of these pension systems are based on, it was not true. It was false. It was based on the margins that we talked about in this video, the very tight margins and assumptions, which are not sustainable. So throw them out, right? The problem is that, and this is what you have to realize, whether or not you are one of those people or not, it affects all of us, because what it's going to do is it's then going to challenge what I call as the rentier class, or the people who actually own the assets, right? So let's say you own a house in a city, okay, we'll call it Phoenix. You can call it LA, you can call it a lot of things, Chicago, Detroit. If you're in one of these cities, or if you're in any city, what you probably should do is check out the solvency of the pension system, because as those pension systems become more compromised and their solvency issue becomes more magnified, what's actually going to happen is two things. You're going to see a reduction in services that are provided to you, whether it's your police systems or your fire systems or your utility systems or your healthcare systems even. And you're going to see perhaps higher taxes, okay, in the form of paying to some extent the pension obligations. And so it's actually a higher tax on your assets that you thought you owed, but now with these burdens of some ridiculous amounts, okay, basically extortion fees to pay the promises that a lot of these people were made, it's going to actually put a lot of pressure on you as an owner. So it kind of begs the question about where, from a global standpoint, or where from even a county or not a county, a state perspective or a national perspective, who's in the best position that doesn't have a lot of these obligations? Because even if you as an individual are speculating in the right way and you invest in a property that has all the facets we talked about, gives you the ability to be more independent in many of the ways that are needed for the new way in which people and humans need to do things. If the community around you, that is the state and the city governments, are somehow compromised or insolvent in some ways, they can indeed go after certain individuals and extort them for money and thereby bankrupt them in some ways. So those are some things to just be aware of. And as we go on in this crisis, or whatever you want to call it, I'll be doing more videos to highlight education on those types of aspects, so that hopefully we can position ourselves and speculate in a way that mitigates those types of issues from occurring, and looking at other types of systems to buffer our buffer our situations, right? One of the things I'm looking at even right now is this real estate ability to invest in real estate with other people, but with not even one or two people. I'm saying like a tribe of people in a sense, where you have tenants in common to own land or own larger types of buildings that are maybe unitized, and using something like a tenants in common to own it more outright or have a higher down payment with increased buffers of insurance to keep that type of a system very solvent, but allow people to have the ownership and have the features that are required for transitioning into the system. So I'm actually interested if other people are looking at those kinds of things, and I'd love to hear from you if you are. If you have an interest in that, or you've been looking at those kinds of things, this is a real good opportunity, I think, and a really good time to connect. It's not to say that by tomorrow everything happens, but I mean, over time, if you research into these things, I think there will be a lot of dividends to be ahead of maybe what other people will be eventually thinking about, because as the system transitions, there will be a need to do things, I think, in a different way, and it's important for us to be at the forefront of that. Otherwise, we end up paying, right? Just like what we did several weeks ago, preparing in some ways with food and water and toilet paper and just ridiculous things. I think people who did that saw a lot of benefits because they didn't have to succumb to the stresses and pressures of the market that we have today, which those supplies are almost non-existent. So things like seeds, things like land that has land that you can actually grow food on, solvent cities, solvent governments, okay, that are well run, that don't have a lot of debt, don't have a lot of pension obligations. We need to do some research there, because there's a lot of benefit to investing in those types of areas versus others who might seem cheap, but obviously if they have those types of obligations, they will be putting stress perhaps onto you, putting speculation onto you that you wouldn't otherwise want to take on as an investor, looking at assets that aren't tied to debt instruments, looking at Bitcoin obviously is a big one that is permissionless, transparent, auditable, right? You guys know OGs like myself are actually doing DCA right now, right? So dollar cost averaging. We're not looking at the price and hoping it moons, okay? Bitcoin in this crisis will now be seen, and I predict, as more of a critical actual utility because of the compromised financial systems that we're all dealing with. And so with compromised financial systems that are exposed, which with the linchpin of something like a 19, you're going to see assets like Bitcoin and gold, from a valuation standpoint increase. And so it's important to be in front of that, ahead of the herd. Obviously don't want to wait for the mainstream news, be a little bit of a contrarian, and, I can't tell you to do that. I'm saying that's my style on this channel. That's what Phoenix is about. And so, the next move, I think, especially with the deceleration in credit creation, which we're seeing now with these mortgage loan requirements, is to pool some money together maybe and look at some of these assets like land and check off another one of those boxes for sustainability and independence from a fragile logistics supply chain / security / a lot of different systems all roll into one that are really in a really fragile state, in my opinion. So love to hear your thoughts, guys. I think we've almost been going for an hour here. I want to thank you for tuning into this channel. I hope you guys are doing well. You're staying healthy, you're staying safe. This is Phoenix signing off. It's, again, Sunday, April 19th, 2020. It's hard to believe. So with that, we'll leave it here. And until next time, peace.